Hey everyone, my name is John Jackson. I'm also known as Attorney Somm. I'm known as Attorney Somm because while I practice data privacy and intellectual property litigation by day, I also pursue my passion for wine when I am not acting as an attorney. And that pursuit involves a number of things, including pursuing my level 4 sommelier certification from the DWSET. I also write some articles, including one that was published in Forbes. I have the Instagram page, as many of you know. I'm very excited today because we have Meredith Gray with us, and she'll be joining us shortly. We're going to be tasting through some excellent Ruinart Champagne. We will also be talking about the history and heritage of Ruinart, which was one of the first champagne houses. Hi, Meredith, how are you?
Hi, John. I'm good. How are you?
Excellent. Everyone, I'd like to introduce you to Meredith Gray. Meredith is the Prestige Ambassador for the Central United States, which includes the great state of Texas, of course. And Meredith, in addition to representing Ruinart, she actually represents Dom Perignon and Krug as well. So she has one of the better jobs that anyone else I know has. So she gets lots of good opportunities to taste high-end champagne, and we're certainly very excited to have her with us here today. And so whether you're watching live or on the replay, thanks so much for joining us. And with that, I think, Meredith, I'll turn things over to you. If you could please start by telling us about the history of Ruinart and how it all began, and some of the key milestones along the way.
So Ruinart has incredible historical significance. They're actually considered the first officially established champagne house. They've been making champagne for almost 300 years. They were established officially in 1729. As the first established champagne house, this came about because in 1728, King Louis XV published a decree allowing wine to be shipped in bottles. So prior to that, it was only permitted to ship wine in barrels, primarily because it was able to easily be spotted and taxed on a ship coming into port. It was easy to smuggle some bottles in somewhere that you were traveling. The new king, King Louis XV, he finally allowed the shipment of wine in bottles, which is essential for transporting champagne. Or transporting sparkling wine, I should say, because at this time champagne was not known for the sparkling wine that it is now. But this really opened the doors for Ruinart. So they saw this opportunity to start exporting what at that time had just been a sparkling wine that was really just kind of consumed regionally. They would give it as gifts to just customers in the textile trade. Nicolas Ruinart, the founder of the house, he was a textile trader at the time, and while making some sparkling wine, he'd gift it to some of his customers. With the publishing of this decree, he saw the opportunity, established his champagne house officially in 1729, and the first bottles were shipped out in 1730. And this really opened the door for many other champagne houses to follow suit in the early 1700s. And then, from there on out, they were pioneers in many ways, but that was a great start for them.
And certainly for those of us in the United States, that's pretty remarkable because Ruinart was actually established before the Declaration of Independence, decades before actually. So that's pretty interesting for sure. And if you could maybe talk about some of the key milestones along the way. Like I know we've seen the chalk caves that are used for the wines. If you could maybe tell us a little bit about those. And I guess they're a UNESCO heritage site now as well. Is that correct?
Absolutely, they are. So they were deemed a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2015. Actually acquired these historic crayers in 1768. So they were acquired with the property at 4 Rue de Crayer. And these chalk quarries or caves were just basically underneath the property that they purchased. And these were dug out during Roman times, really to build the city of Reims. Ruinart was the first to actually use these quarries to store their bottles and age their bottles. And you can think of these crayers as really being the perfect environment for fermenting and storing champagne. It's incredibly stable, no vibrations. It's dark. Temperature is naturally regulated. It's about 52 degrees constantly. And there's great humidity because the chalk underneath the surface of the earth has really great humidity. So it retains a lot of humidity. So if you think about it, it's the perfect environment for aging and storing wine and champagne. So that's exactly what they did. They were the first to do that. And the crayers are also incredibly significant because during the World Wars, they actually served as really the city. There was continuous bombings going on throughout the city of Reims because historically Champagne has been at a crossroads in Europe, for better or for worse, for eternity. So they really experienced a lot of the negative ramifications of being in that location during these world wars. So they really moved the cities underground. They had schools down there, offices down there, horse-drawn carriages going through these miles-long dugout quarries underground, 125 feet underground in Reims. So One of the main reasons why it's deemed historic today, but also just being that Champagne is so central and really an emblem to French culture. There's such significant, in many ways, that these creators hold, and Ruinart is lucky to have these at their property. So it's a great spot to visit. Once things go back to normal, I highly recommend visiting them. They're vast, just incredible, breathtaking, definitely worth a visit.
And Meredith, it's my understanding as well that the House of Ruinart has more of a Chardonnay focus. Could you tell us how that all began and why they focused on Chardonnay?
So this is really interesting, and it's there were a few events that kind of set this into motion. But starting back, so after the founding of the house and really throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Champagne really became known for champagne, and it was a symbol of iconic French culture and art de vivre. And they had been exporting to other markets for centuries, and by 1910, Ruinart did about 95% of their business in export markets, and this was great. The house really took direct hits during the World Wars, during the Great Depression. In World War I, the house was completely destroyed. They rebuilt it. During the Great Depression, there was a stoppage of exports, and in World War II, pretty much their entire collection of wine was consumed or destroyed by the wine Führer. Really, they had to rebuild several times. And so it wasn't until 1946, after World War II, the last family member, 8th generation Ruinart, to run the house, Bertrand Muir, he decided to really rebuild the house and rebuild, I guess, the signature of Ruinart. He really is the one who's responsible for shifting the focus to Chardonnay. And there's a great quote, our chef de cave, Frédéric Panayiotis, he had an opportunity to speak with Bertrand Muir before he passed away. And he asked him, so why this shift to Chardonnay? Chardonnay was, so unpopular at the time. People were drinking Pinot Noir, and much of the wine and sparkling wine of the time being consumed was much more, much fuller and winey by nature. Why Chardonnay? And he said, champagne is best drunk from 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 a.m. the next morning. Meaning he appreciated easy drinking, approachable, fresh champagne. And that's really the route that he wanted to take with Ruinart. So this was pretty pioneering because at the time, like I said, Pinot Noir was pretty dominant. Really, he wanted to create a champagne based on something that was easy drinking, approachable, a glass should call for another glass type of thing. So we have Bertrand Muir to really thank for this shift to Chardonnay, which is still the signature of the house. Very fresh, easy to drink, not simple. So if that makes sense, which is what we like to call simplexity. It's kind of like, sushi. It's very simple. It's fish on rice, but it's not simple. The execution, the detail, and the simplicity really makes it complex. So we like to use the term simplexity when we talk about Ruinart. Would
you like to, add anything if you were describing the house style? How would you characterize the house style of Ruinart?
Ruinart, as I mentioned, Chardonnay is their signature. So there's a high percentage of Chardonnay in all of the blends, even the rosé. But really, just across the board, it's all about just being light, fresh, elegant, easy drinking, silky, just elegant wines. That's kind of what they're going for with all of the cuvées. It's reductive in style, so there's no oak whatsoever. So they try to limit exposure to oxygen during the winemaking process, because oxidation can really kind of kill fresh aromas, which is what we're trying to capture with Ruinart, is that freshness, that aromatic freshness. So no oxidation, limiting of oxygen throughout the entire winemaking process. Only stainless steel is used. Yeah, just really capturing and expressing that aromatic freshness through Chardonnay across the board, the house style that gets expressed through all of the cuvées.
Okay, great. And I know we'll get to this a little bit when we go through each of the different champagnes, but what about some of the fruit sources for Ruinart? Could you tell us a little bit about where the fruit sources come from?
Definitely. So our property is in Reims, Gruyere, and so one of our primary sites is in CELLAR, where we actually get some of our Grand Cru Chardonnay from Ruinart. But we also use a little bit of our Grand Cru Chardonnay in the non-vintage Blanc de Blanc as well. And this is pretty unique because CELLAR is in the Montagne de Reims, which is pretty much known for being Pinot Noir country. There's a lot of Pinot Noir in the Montagne de Reims. However, in CELLAR, there's some great sites that have a little bit of chalk in the soil and also great eastern and southeastern exposure which is perfect for Chardonnay. I think technically the reason for that is less humidity in the morning, but it historically has just allowed Chardonnay to really express itself best when it's grown in sites that are east-facing. So in the middle of this Pinot Noir country, there's these great plots in Sillery that are Grand Cru for Chardonnay, and that's where we source a lot of our, Grand Cru. And we also source some Premier Crus from the Montagne de Reims and the Côte de Blanc. The Côte de Blanc is where a lot of Chardonnay is grown, very chalky soils, so excellent for Chardonnay. For the Pinot Noir that we use for our rosés as well, we use Premier Crus and Grand Cru from Verzenay.
Okay, fantastic. And I noticed you didn't mention Meunier. Is there any Meunier included in any of the champagnes at all, or is it all Chardonnay and or a little bit of Pinot?
It's all Chardonnay and Pinot. So every cuvee has a high percentage of Chardonnay, and then actually with our rosé as well, it's about 55% Pinot Noir, 45% Chardonnay, which is really high for a rosé. And then actually for our Dom Ruinart rosé vintage, that one's actually the only Pinot Noir in that blend is the still red wine used to make the rosé. Everything else is Chardonnay completely. So no Meunier in these cuvées. Ruinart does make another cuvée that doesn't get distributed here in the US. It's called Ruinart R. There's a non-vintage and a vintage, and that one uses a little bit of Meunier, but that one is distributed exclusively in Europe and Asia. We don't see any of that one here. So yeah, we're just the Chardonnay and the Pinot for us here in the US.
Okay, great. Well, should we get started with the tasting?
Sounds good.
Excellent. The first wine we have is the Blanc de Blanc non-vintage. So could you tell us a little bit about that champagne?
Absolutely. So the Blanc de Blanc non-vintage is really the flagship of the house. So with Chardonnay being their signature, this is really the fullest expression of the aromatic freshness. 100% Chardonnay, Blanc de Blanc, produced from a blend of wines sourced from Cru, Chardonnay, the whole of Montagne de Reims and the Côte de Blanc, like we were talking about before. Montagne de Reims has a lot of great sites with that eastern and southeast facing exposure, which is great for Chardonnay. And then in the Côte de Blanc, very chalky soils, which are excellent for Chardonnay. And we also source a little bit of Chardonnay from Sillery Grand Cru that we put in our non-vintage Blanc de Blanc blend as well. Really what we're going for here is a balance between freshness and roundness, which is great and which is one of my personal favorite things about Ruinart, because Chardonnay can tend to be a little bit austere sometimes. Blanc de Blanc champagnes can tend to have a really green, racy acidity to them. Ruinart is completely different. They have that great freshness, the acidity, the elegance that you would expect from Chardonnay, but you do really get a really great silkiness and roundness here as well. So it's beautifully balanced, and really that comes from the sourcing of our grapes. We do use a few village crus as well, in Cézanne and Vitry. That gives us some wines that really are tropical fruit driven. The village crus also allow us to mature the wines in a way in a pretty quick 3 years to allow them to be, approachable, ready to drink, balanced at the time of release. We use about 20 to 25% of young reserve wines. Again, to just really highlight that freshness. We're not going to go back too far, just 2 to 3 years of reserve wines to keep it young, fresh, light, and elegant. And as I mentioned in the house style, only stainless steel, so we want to prevent as much oxygenous exposure as possible, because exposure to oxygen really kind of kills that freshness. Your full malolactic fermentation, which really helps to kind of integrate that silkiness, gives a really fantastic mouthfeel. Yeah, the low dosage also just gives it a little bit of a textural balance. It's about 7.5 grams per liter.
Yeah, and so the malolactic fermentation actually reduces the overall acidity and does add some texture and some roundness as well. So it already has plenty of acidity, and so it can certainly absorb the reduction from the malolactic. But that does give it a really nice mouthfeel, which is certainly very intriguing.
Yeah.
And yeah, certainly you're getting a lot of descriptors like white peach and ginger. There's a little bit of like a gunflint, a little bit like what you'd get with a little bit of a smokiness, which is interesting, certainly. And then some exotic spices as well.
Definitely. I always point out there's a little bit of cardamom, like green spices, the cardamom, ginger, I think you said. And yeah, white peach, ripe citrus, a little bit of pineapple.
And my favorite Indian dessert in the entire world is gulab jamun. And I actually get a little bit of the same aromatics that I get with that dessert from here.
Yeah.
So, and that has a lot of the cardamom and the liquid. For those who are interested, what is the price point for the Blanc de Blanc non-vintage?
So retail price point, I'd say around $65 in retail for the Blanc de Blanc, depending on where you shop.
I know I oftentimes see deals for a 6-pack as well. So sometimes the case of 6, there might be a deal on that, which is something I always tend to stock up on. So
Yeah,
this has definitely been a staple in my cellar for a number of years now.
Yeah, this is a beautiful wine. This is one of my favorites that I work with, just because it is so easy drinking. You know, it's approachable, but it's versatile. This is great just as an aperitif. As I quoted Bertrand Muir earlier, you know, a glass should call for another glass, and you should be able to consume champagne from 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock the next morning. So this is something that is easy to sip on, but you can also pair it with food because it has that great acidity. You know, it's such a food-friendly wine. It's not going to compete with any of the flavors of what you might be pairing it with. One of my absolute favorite pairings is Ruinart Blanc de Blanc and French fries. That richness, the acidity from the champagne really cuts the richness of the French fries. Ruinart Blanc de Blanc is fantastic with sushi, crudos, things of that sort. Great balance.
Yeah, definitely. I'm somebody who always gets it with sushi. That's, in my view, one of the best pairings there is Blanc de Blanc with sushi for sure. So if I'm at a restaurant, I'll go straight to the Blanc de Blanc every time. Excellent. Well, shall we shift gears and go to the vintage Blanc de Blanc?
Perfect. Sounds good.
And this is actually the 2007 vintage.
Yeah.
And before we get into it, could you tell us a little bit about the 2007 vintage? I know it's interesting because some producers did not declare vintage for '07. And so what was it about Ruinart, and why did they decide to declare vintage in 2007?
Yeah, 2007 was a really odd year, a very uneven year, so to speak, really inconsistent just across the board. Started pretty warm, and then they saw some heavy rains. This ended up not being very good for Pinot Noir and Meunier, which had a lot of problems from the humidity with rot and mildew. But the circumstances really resulted in a lot of great Chardonnay. So the few houses that released vintages in 2007 were Chardonnay houses or Chardonnay cuvées. So I think Cat&J Comte Champagne, they had a 2007 as well. That's 100% Chardonnay. Cristal, I believe, had a 2007 as well. But yeah, it was pretty rare. But ultimately, it was the health of the Chardonnay that really allowed Dom Ruinart to make a vintage in this year. The 2007s are incredibly approachable now. They're, drinking beautifully. With the Dom Ruinart, really it's a way to showcase the personality of the vintage, so 2007, while also highlighting the signature of the house, which with Ruinart is the Chardonnay, provenance of that Chardonnay. So with Dom Ruinart, it's 100% Grand Cru, and we source from the Montagne de Reims Côte de Blanc. De Blanc, we source from Chouilly, Menil, Auger, and Abyss, and then in Montagne de Reims, Sillery, Berzenay, which again, known for Pinot Noir, but there are some great Chardonnay sites with that Eastern exposure there. Yeah, the winemaking is really the same. It's these Grand Cru grapes that we're using that really carry this wine in a different way. So compared to the non-vintage, so same winemaking style, very reductive, limiting exposure to oxygen, stainless steel only. And the non-vintage is very, fresh, aromatic, citrus, white flowers. Whereas with the Dom Ruinart, the complexity is very different. It's toasty, you get a little bit more of that gunpowder, which is typical of Grand Cru Burgundy.
Yeah, and a lot more of the characteristics from the lees aging. I understand this one ages for 9 to 10 years on average, and so you get a lot of those lees aging descriptors, like the brioche and the toasted bread and things of that nature as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot. And really, the Grand Cru grapes, they need that time to really express themselves fully. And after 9-10 years, you really get the expression of that depth, that complexity. There's a lot more weight on your palate and a lot more layers, a lot of that bottle aging complexity too, the brioche, like you were saying. All of that comes from the quality of the grapes and they spend aging. And Dom Ruinart vintage is really just kind of a gift of nature. Take the best Chardonnay from the best sites and the best vintages. It does its thing, and it's beautiful wine. Is my understanding
correct that even when a vintage is declared, that only about 2% of the fruit ultimately makes it into the vintage Blanc de Blanc?
Exactly. Yep. So 2% of in a good year, 2% of what we produce will be Dom Ruinart. So it's an incredibly rare champagne when you think about it in the grand scheme, but quite a treat if you can get your hands on some.
And what would the price point of this wine be, the vintage Blanc de Blanc 2007?
So I think this one, again, depending on where you shop, around 160, 170 a bottle. If you think about it, it's if you compare it to Grand Cru Burgundy, which is what I like to do, purchasing a Premier Cru Burgundy, those are around, $160, $175. In Grand Cru Burgundy, that'll run you, $300 a bottle. This is Grand Cru Chardonnay from Champagne. It's a heck of a value. Because you do get that same complexity, all of those layers that you would get in a Burgundy. And I think fruit pairings are the same too. This has got great fullness that you can really kind of take it up a notch with your fruit pairings. Sea bass, lobster, white meats, chicken, goat cheese. Yeah, those are some of my favorite.
Okay. Or just by itself. It's beautiful by itself as well.
By itself, always.
That's oftentimes how I drink it, just to start the night with some champagne, or finish the night too. There's never really a bad time for it. I like the 9 a.m. to 9 a.m. time frame because that pretty much covers it.
I completely agree.
And anything else you want to say about the vintage Blanc de Blanc, or should we shift gears and go to the rosé non-vintage?
Yeah, so I guess with the Dom Ruinart, these the 2007 is drinking beautifully right now, very approachable. These wines have incredible aging potential. So it's just going to continue to express itself more and more over the years. So in 2007, the Chardonnays in 2007 have fantastic aging potential. Yeah, I would recommend, if you have the opportunity, buy a few bottles, open one now, open one in a few years, and it'll be a really neat experience.
Has Dom Ruinart declared a vintage for '08? Has that come out yet?
I haven't heard. I know we will be seeing the 2007 Rosé next. I haven't heard an update on when we'll see the next Dom Ruinart vintage 2008. I don't think so, though, but can't confirm.
Okay. And what are some of your favorite vintages of Dom Ruinart vintage Blanc de Blanc?
Gosh, I love the 2006. So the last two vintages that we had were the 2004 and the 2006 in the Dom Ruinart. 2004 had a little bit more of kind of a linear acidity to it. So again, if we're comparing Burgundy, the 04 was a little bit more like Chablis. The 06 had this great, just kind of voluptuousness to it, and really rich, just silky, kind of a lot of great creaminess, richness to it. And I love that. So I'd say the 06 was probably my favorite over the past few years. And then, of course, can't forget the 02. I actually never had a chance to try the 02, but I can only imagine how beautiful that was. So
yeah, that was a great vintage as well.
Yeah, it was a great vintage.
And maybe before we start talking about that, certainly for the non-vintage, we see some unique bottle shapes compared to a traditional bottle. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the shape of the bottle and where that first started.
So Ruinart being the first established champagne house, in that time, so in the 18th century, all bottles were hand-blown. To this day, Ruinart is essentially celebrating the original bottles of the 18th century hand-blown bottles by maintaining that shape. Bottles aren't hand-blown anymore, but essentially this is an ode to that era.
Oh, that's real neat how they do that. It's always a unique shape, and it's even more interesting when you see the small formats, the half bottles. It's even more pronounced with a smaller bottle size, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, definitely. It's a unique shape, but it's beautiful. It's got, kind of the roundness, the neck of the bottle is really kind of unique and eye-catching, and also just the clear glass on the Blanc de Blanc is really neat and just, again, very eye-catching. Just kind of, an expression of light that they try to emulate within the packaging as well.
And so that's on both of the non-vintage bottles, that shape. Well, why don't we go ahead and talk about the rosé then? What would you like to say to introduce the rosé before we get into the tasting notes?
Rosé, incredibly significant for Ruinart as well, because they are actually the first house to produce a rosé champagne, pioneers in many ways. So the first rosé champagne was made very differently than it is today. So in 1764 is when the record of the first sale of rosé was found to be. And it was done by maceration of the wine with elderberry flowers. So that's how it got that red tint. And today it's done completely differently. So today we create something called rosé d'assemblage, which is essentially a blend of an otherwise blanc champagne with a still vinified red wine. So we're blending a red wine in with our champagne to produce a rosé. So for Ruinart Rosé non-vintage, we use Premier Cru vinified red wine that we macerate at a low temperature for about 1 week, because we really just want to extract the color and the flavor during that time and not the tannins. So the low temperature and the short time frame allows us to do that. Again, same with the non-vintage Blanc de Blanc. The goal is to really maintain that freshness and that roundness. So we don't want to extract a lot of the structure when we're vinifying the still red wine to add to the rosé. So pretty consistent with the Ruinart style there. A very high percentage of Chardonnay still in the blend. 45% Chardonnay, 55% Pinot Noir. Of that, it's about 15% of that vinified still red wine. Yeah, what it ultimately ends up doing is it really gives it a nice lifted taste profile. So it's not coming through really heavily with the red fruit. It's a little bit more of a tropical profile. So I think pink grapefruit, guava, lychee, and all of that comes from really just the lifting of the Chardonnay, the high proportion of Chardonnay in the blend.
At some of the dinners you've had that I've attended, there's been some rosé champagne that's been as much as 25 or 30% rosé. And with that, it's really almost like a burgundy on the nose, a red burgundy. But you're right, with this one, you're getting more of the Chardonnay aromatics for sure. And the Pinot's much more subtle.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and it's really unique in that regard. You know, typically, rosés do have quite a bit of structure to them. Rosé champagnes, that is, and they highlight a little bit more of that red fruit. So with this, very tropical profile and this high percentage of Chardonnay, got that great roundness and freshness balance that I love. Yeah, great texture as well. Very easy drinking rosé.
Yeah, more complexity.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. How long does this one age? Is it about the same amount of time as the Blanc de Blanc non-vintage?
It is, yeah. So winemaking is pretty much the same as the Blanc de Blanc non-vintage. So it ages for about 2.5 years on the lees. And they use young reserve wines as well. So, and about 20 to 25% of reserve wines, just going back about 2 to 3 years. So young wines, a small amount of young wines with really just allowing them to maintain that freshness and roundness.
Great. And for those who are interested, what is the price point on this wine?
So the rosé is typically going to be a few dollars more than the Blanc de Blanc non-vintage. So I'd say around 70, 75, depending on where you're shopping. Yeah.
That's an excellent price for rosé champagne, though, because a lot of the rosé champagne is very high now, and there's not so many that are under $100 at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I completely agree.
Great. And should we talk about we don't have it with us to taste today, but why don't we talk a little bit more about the vintage Dom Ruinart Rosé 2004? Is that the one that's currently available?
Yeah. So the Dom Ruinart Rosé 2004, that's the last of our cuvées available here in the U.S. And this is a really special wine, super rare, but we do get some here in Texas, which is fantastic. It's absolutely delicious. And as I mentioned before, I think this is really unique for a rosé. This is entirely Chardonnay, except for the still vinified Pinot Noir that's added to the blend. And we do about 15 to 20% of that still Pinot Noir that we blend in. It's Grand Cru Pinot Noir, so similar to the Dom Ruinart Blanc de Blanc. It's 100% Grand Cru fruit. And the vinified Grand Cru Pinot Noir that we use is from CELLAR or Verzenay, depending on the year. And we do actually, when we're making the red wine for the Dom Ruinart Rosé, we do extract the grapes for a little bit longer and at a little bit higher temperature to extract some structure. So some of that tannin structure. And the lees aging, so the extended time on the lees, about 10 to 12 years, depending on the vintage, really softens those tannins in that structure. And so over time, the structure will fade a little bit. The tannins will literally polymerize. You kind of need this structure to carry the wines through that time, that amount of time aging on the lees. And what you're left with when it's done is this incredible aromatic nose of dried flowers, dried fruit, spices, but still lifted from that high proportion of Chardonnay. It's really unique. Such a beautiful wine. It's a treat anytime I get to try it. But I would recommend it if you find one.
And that's produced in much lower quantities than the others. Is that right?
It is, yeah. We get a few cases here in Texas, and currently we're on the vintage 2004. Yeah, I'd say we get about a quarter of the volume of that one than we do of the Dom Ruinart Blanc de Blanc. So even more rare than the Dom Ruinart Blanc de Blanc.
And the next one to come out will be the '07. Do you know the timing for the release of the '07 Dom Ruinart Rosé?
Hopefully by the middle of next year. So I think it's starting to be released in certain markets, but hopefully we'll have it here in Texas, pending how the beginning of next year goes, but hopefully we'll have it here in Texas by the middle of 2021.
And I know some people like to drink their champagne in magnums in the large formats. What is it about the magnum, the large format size, that's particularly well suited for champagne?
Yeah, absolutely. So magnums, large formats, are my personal favorite way to enjoy champagne. And I think the reason for that is they're really interesting because it's the same wine in the bottle, essentially, that you would find in a 750 or standard size bottle. It needs to age for a little bit longer. So, and the aging is gradual. So if you think about it, a magnum is twice the size of a standard bottle. So you have twice the amount of liquid and virtually the same opening size with the neck of the bottle and the cork. So in order to allow these wines to age properly, you need a little bit more time for virtually the same amount of oxygen to affect twice the amount of liquid. So it's a much more gradual maturation process. What you end up with is really kind of this very similar with Ruinart, very similar aromatic freshness, but a little bit more of those secondary aromas, that toastiness, that nuttiness that you get from the lees aging. That really ends up coming through a lot more on large formats. And the effervescence always tends to be a little bit more well integrated as well, which you'll find with wines that spend a little bit more time on the lees. So the bubbles are just tiny, delicate, really slow moving, which gives it a really silky texture. Yeah, I would highly recommend magnums as the perfect amount of champagne for two people.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's right. And we have a question here about food pairings for the rosé. What do you recommend as a food pairing for the Ruinart Rosé?
So Ruinart Rosé is probably the most versatile. It's really, you can consider it kind of the red wine drinker's champagne. It's great as an aperitif because of that aromatic freshness, roundness. It's approachable, but it's also great with food pairing. So because of the addition of that still vinified Pinot Noir, you can really pair it with some things with a little more punch. So, quail, duck, prawns, smoked salmon, things with pack a little bit more flavor. I wouldn't be afraid to pair with red meats, things of that sort. The acidity and the freshness will really allow this wine to stand up to some of those flavors, and then the red wine in there as well will pair beautifully.
What do you think of champagne flutes? Do you use those when you drink your champagne? And if not, what else do you use instead?
Great question. So champagne flutes, well, they're beautiful, and I used to use them often, but they're really not the best vessel for enjoying champagne. If you think about it, you really wouldn't consume any other wine out of a flute because what it's doing is it's constricting the aromatics into a really small area. And when we taste, you taste a lot with your nose first. So when you're drinking out of a flute, you're really masking a lot of the aromatics of the wine. So you're not experience. And so really the perfect vessel for drinking champagne is just your standard white wine glass. Ruinart uses tulips a lot too, so that's just a little bit wider of a base, and then it kind of closes at the top. Yeah, this really allows the wine to open up, and with a wine with this much age on it, the minimum age requirements for all champagne is in a place where you really need to allow the wine to kind of open up and express itself after you pour a glass. So it'll really benefit from that surface contact with the air. And so I would say, feel comfortable pouring a glass of champagne, and what you do is for a white wine glass at home, you'll get the fullest expression and the best experience there.
And I know you talked a little bit about some of the vintage offerings improving with bottle age. What about the non-vintage? Do you recommend additional bottle age for that, or is that more designed to be consumed shortly after purchase and release?
Yeah, so the non-vintages are pretty much crafted to be consumed upon release. So they're ready to drink once they hit the market. And I wouldn't recommend a lot of extended cellaring on the non-vintage. You might see, some neat transformations, some, tertiary aromas develop in time, but it's really the best it's going to be consumed really young and fresh, because that's how the wine is crafted. So I wouldn't recommend a lot of bottle age on that. Consume within the first 2 years or so, 1 to 2 years.
The stemware discussion prompted a question. The question is, would you drink the vintage champagne out of a goblet?
So for me, I wouldn't recommend that vessel either, just because it's kind of, with the wine glasses, the shape of the wine glass, although you do have, the bowl of the glass that's allowing a lot of surface area for the wine, it closes at the top and kind of captures a lot of those aromatics, whereas with a coupe or goblet glass, you're kind of losing a little bit of that. It's not really being channeled. And you lose, I just found personally, you lose a lot more effervescence drinking out of a coupe. So not to say that the wine still isn't fantastic on its own, but I think they're pretty and they're beautiful. And if that's how you like to enjoy your champagne, by all means, please do. But it's going to be a very different experience with less bubbles and, a little bit of less aromatic concentration.
Yep. And maybe if they pour a smaller amount and drink it quickly, then it wouldn't suffer as much from the oxygen exposure as well.
There you go. Yep.
Yep. And someone was also wondering about a decant on any of these champagnes. Is that something that you would recommend?
So potentially for the Dom Ruinart, that's absolutely something you could do. As I mentioned, being the Grand Cru fruit, it's got incredible depth and complexity that will continue to express itself upon opening. So anytime you decant champagne, though, you do lose some of the effervescence, but I mean, the wine behind the effervescence, can really stand alone, bubbles aside. So it would be a different experience, but certainly one that would bring out a totally different side of the wine.
We actually have an interesting question as well about kind of the late disgorgement or the recently disgorged type programs that are out there for some producers. And specifically with respect to magnums, if there's been any consideration or any thought that you know of to having aged magnums that undergo additional aging at the house and then are released into the market when they're pretty much ready to go. Because oftentimes collectors who like aged champagne out of magnum will have to age them on their own for an additional 5 or 10 years or more.
Mm-hmm. So we don't have any of those programs going quite yet, but I have heard rumors that there is a possibility we might do that in the future. I'm not sure when, but I think in order to execute that, they probably have something set aside now. I think it would be fantastic because it's an amazing experience revisiting old wines that have been perfectly cellared or experienced extended lees aging at the maison. So I have heard some rumors. I would love it if they were true, but hopefully I think there's a possibility we might see something like that in the future.
Yeah. Of course, the price would be higher, but then people wouldn't have to age that on their own and take up their cellar space. So then they could drink it pretty quickly after purchase that way. And that might be a nice option to have as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Well, it looks like we've gotten through all the questions. So thanks so much for joining us. We've learned a lot today. We've learned about Ruinart being the first champagne house in 1729 and its rich heritage along the way, being the first rosé champagne, and some of the house style characteristics, which include freshness and easy approachability and simplexity. And then we did a tasting of the Blanc de Blanc non-vintage, the Rosé non-vintage, and the 07 vintage Dom Ruinart Blanc de Blanc. And so certainly, if any of you are interested in purchasing these and can't find a place near you, by all means, let me know or let Meredith know. She's Mayor Force One on Instagram. So we're certainly happy to put you in touch with the people so you can source these wines yourselves as well. And thanks so much for joining us, Meredith.
Thanks, John.